Welcome to EESC 418. This is lecture 3B. We're continuing on with our common errors, and we have more similar words with similar meanings. Some of these sound the same, some of them sound totally different, but have very similar meanings. And in a lot of cases, in everyday language, we'll use these terms interchangeably without really understanding that they are different. So let's start with a category of words which are describing countable or non-countable nouns. So a lot of the times we're talking about quantities. And I want to distinguish between countable and measurable. So the things that we're talking about here, we may or may not be able to measure them, but we can't count them. So for example, I'll use water. We can measure water volumes, water levels. We can measure the amount, but we don't count the number of water. We do, however, count the number of rivers or lakes or ponds or streams, and these are countable nouns, even though we might be talking about the same thing. So the way we describe them will vary depending on the noun we're using. So if we're using a countable noun, we would describe it using a number of, few, fewer, or many. For a non-countable quantity like water, we would use an amount of, little, less, or much. So I'll use some examples of these. A number of rivers flow through the landscape. A large amount of water flows through the landscape. If I were to mix these up and say a large amount of rivers flow through the landscape, that might actually sound fine if we say it out loud. You may or may not notice that that's incorrect. If I switch that though and I say a number of water flows through the landscape, you'd probably hear that immediately as being incorrect. So some of these sound incorrect and some don't. I'll use another example. Fewer rivers flow through the landscape. If I were to say less rivers flow through the landscape, some people might notice that's incorrect, some people might not. A lot of people would just say less. We use that in everyday language. It is incorrect though. So less water flows through the landscape, fewer rivers flow through the landscape. Similarly, many rivers flow through the landscape, but more water flows through the landscape. So depending on whether it's countable or non-countable, we should stick to the proper qualifier. There are a couple of other very important words in environmental science that seem similar, although they have very different meanings. So disinterested. So this means impartial, not biased by personal feelings. And it's different from uninterested, which means basically bored or not interested in something. So in environmental science, we do need to be disinterested. This means that we can evaluate the science without being personally invested in it. We're disinterested. It just means that we're not taking it personally. However, we should be interested. Hopefully you're in this course because you're interested in earth science. To me, uninterested in environmental science or earth science seems like a total oxymoron. I don't know how anybody could be uninterested in environmental science. Seems impossible. However, grammatically that might be correct. So using a couple of sentences on the right here, the assessment will require a disinterested scientist. So we need somebody who will not be biased. We need somebody who's disinterested. Similarly, the student was uninterested and just wanted to get through the course. I suppose that's possible. Probably not for this course, but theoretically possible. Okay, words that seem similar. That in which. These are probably the most difficult words to distinguish for a lot of people. And so on the blog site where I've listed the lectures, I've linked to a few really good websites that describe the differences between that and which and when you would use one and when you would use the other. These are also both covered in the textbook, although I would say the textbook covers them very briefly. The best source is that online writing laboratory at Purdue University that I've linked to. So please spend some time on that if you have any difficulty with this concept. So just briefly, that is used for restrictive or defining clauses, which is used for non-restrictive or non-defining clauses. In other words, we use that for a clause that is necessary for understanding the meaning, and we usually do not set it off with a comma. So we don't have a comma, space, that, followed by some phrase that is going to finish our sentence. On the other hand, when we use which, it typically does have a comma because we're setting it apart, because it's non-restrictive, it's non-essential information. So I'll go through a couple of examples here. Plagioclase has an oblique cleavage. It is a triclinic feldspar. So this sentence doesn't use either that or which. I'm simply using this to introduce two concepts which I would like to combine into a single sentence just to make it a little bit more readable. Because we can have a technical document that is grammatically correct, that has many sentences in a row, all of which are correct, but it just won't flow nicely. So we want to use that in which to combine concepts, particularly if they're supporting each other's meaning, and it will make the sentence flow a little bit more nicely. So first I'll use it incorrectly. Plagioclase is a triclinic feldspar which has an oblique cleavage. Now this actually sounds right when I say it out loud. The problem here is that I don't really know what I'm referring to when I say which has an oblique cleavage. I'm actually meaning that plagioclase has an oblique cleavage, but the way I've worded this is actually a misplaced modifier. It looks like I'm referring to feldspar. So let's try and correct that. Plagioclase is a triclinic feldspar that has an oblique cleavage. So this is the third sentence down. So now that is referring to the subject of the sentence, which is still plagioclase, and this is a defining clause. We're still defining plagioclase. Next sentence down. Plagioclase, which is a triclinic feldspar, has an oblique cleavage. Now in this case, which is a triclinic feldspar, is a little bit of non-essential information that we're adding, and that gives it some additional context. It gives the reader some more information, but it doesn't change the fact that plagioclase has an oblique cleavage, which is the subject of the sentence. And now in the fifth sentence, plagioclase is a triclinic feldspar with an oblique cleavage, which is where its Greek name comes from. So the Greek name is actually two words, plagio and klase, which means oblique cleavage. So I've set this non-essential information apart from the rest of the sentence using a comma in which. So I can actually put a period where that comma is, and it would be a complete sentence, totally grammatically correct. And what I've done is just added a little bit of additional information. Okay, for the next bit, I've got a guest lecturer who is joining me by webcast, and I'm pleased to introduce Krista Bedwin. For those of you who were in EESC 315, you may remember she gave a guest lecture on technical writing. And so this is her website. As you can see, she's well qualified to teach technical writing and also a professional chemist like myself. So nice to have her with us. I'll be interviewing her soon. But before I do, I just want to refer you to her blog post that I linked to in the previous lecture. So under Technical Writing for Engineers and Scientists, if we come to this post, you'll see some of the words that we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I will turn it over to Krista. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Krista Bedwin. Like me, Krista graduated from the University of Calgary. She's also got a chemistry degree, but in addition to that, she has a bachelor's of education, and she works as a full-time technical writer and editor. So she's got a lot to say on these topics, and I'm glad to welcome you. Krista, you've got a post on a blog that I linked to for this episode, and it's got a lot of commonly misused words. And as I understand it, this comes from years of doing technical editing and working with scientists and engineers. Can you tell us a little bit about how this list came to be?
So basically, the group that I was working with at Golder, which you also worked at, a lot of people started to realize that the same mistakes were occurring over and over. And to try and make it streamlined and help everybody to improve at the same time, we drew up a list and sort of shared it online, or shared it sometimes in printouts, and tried to get it in front of people so that they would start to correct the mistakes they were making. The problem with making mistakes is the more time you make the mistakes, the deeper you dig the rut, and the more likely you are to keep on making that mistake. So sometimes we had cases, especially of groups that maybe a leader from 10 years ago had started misusing a word and taught everybody to do that. So sometimes it was a case of re-educating people on mistakes they were making. Other times it was just a matter of getting out of some bad habits. So the list helped.
So everything on this list comes from mistakes that were made over and over again. And
Yeah,
there's a few that I want to focus on today. So it's a great list. Let's go through it. I should be sharing my screen if people can see this properly. The first one is among and between. And I have to admit, this is one that I did not realize there's a difference until I took a technical writing course myself. Can you explain what the difference is between among and between?
Okay, and so this one too is one that I think in casual speech, a lot of us would only use between. So I would say maybe between all the group members, we shared our crackers or whatever. You go to a party and we shared everything between us. But actually, if you have a bigger group of people, you should be saying among. So if it's a whole entire group that you're sharing with, then you're sharing something among them. And between is just supposed to be bilateral between me and you, between two groups.
Great. So between two people or among many.
Yeah.
The next one is really important in technical reports. The next one I want to talk about is can and may. And particularly in environmental science, we use the word may a lot because we speak conditionally. We don't want to be too absolute about almost anything. And so can you go over the difference between can and may and why people might use one or the other?
Yeah, so may, as you just sort of mentioned, can also have more legal ramifications. So may means that you have permission. So the, standard thing is a little kid saying, "Mother, may I do whatever?" So do you have permission? So if you're talking in terms of contracts and in terms of what you're supposed to be doing, then you need to be aware of what you may do. Now, what you can do is what you're technically able to do. So, you might have limits of your equipment or limits of your instrumentation that you just cannot do what the client asks all the time. So it's good to be aware of when you're talking about technical limitations and when you're talking about contract limitations. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. The next one I've seen confused a lot, and that is compose and comprise. And I think until people do a lot of technical writing, they probably don't use the word comprise very much. Can you speak a bit about the difference between these and when you might use one or the other?
Right. So compose is just like a music composer. It means you're putting a bunch of things together. You could think of it like putting together the blocks of a quilt, or putting together a team of engineers, putting together a report. So you could say it's composed of these ingredients or these pieces. Comprise means made up of. So because it means made of, people seem to write comprised of or comprises of. So if you want to say, the book comprises 14 chapters, you don't write the book is comprised of 14 chapters. You would say comprises 14 chapters. So one tip for comprises is if it's really confusing you, you can change it with made of or made up of. So if it's confusing, it's a safer one to avoid, but you should just be using it without the word of.
This is one of those words that I would use a fair amount in writing and almost never spoken. So I would almost never say something like, this list comprises several words that are often mistaken, but I would probably write that. So it's one of those interesting words that I use quite a bit in technical writing, but I think that's the first time I've ever spoken it out loud unless I was reading something.
True. And, people also shouldn't be afraid to think about what words you could replace it. Or so testing out a sentence like saying the book comprises 14 chapters, you might just say the book has 14 chapters. So it's good to sort of check yourself by just sort of switching the sentence up sometimes.
Yeah, as our textbook says, it's often useful to just recast the sentence entirely.
Yeah, exactly.
And moving down the list, I like this one. I like Latin words. And in our class, we'll be going over Latin vocabulary in a few weeks in our tutorial, but this is an interesting one because it comes up a lot in writing. So EG and IE, these are probably misused more commonly than they're properly used in my experience. Can you tell us why that is?
So I think the reason that they're misused is because people do not know what EG and IE actually stand for in Latin, which of course your students will after the Latin lesson. So EG means exempli gratia. Not sure of my pronunciation there, but it means an example of it. Here's an example. And IE means that is, id est. So if you're saying that is, you're following it by an explanation. So one is an example. So an example, she put her, she had a dessert, e.g. chocolate cake. Or you could say she had something after dinner, i.e. dessert. So in one case, you're giving an example of a dessert, and the other case, you're giving a further explanation of your technical content. Those were pretty simple examples, but that's the gist of it.
It's pretty clear, exactly. And the key there is look, whenever you see an abbreviation like that, learn the Latin word, and if you can remember the Latin word, it's clear how to properly use it.
And I would say, like, in all cases that people have just gotten used to using letters all the time and they don't use the words all the time, you often see this mistake, even when the letters are representing something in English. They just get confused.
And the next example I wanted to use from your list is not so much one that gets confused as one that might be used intentionally but improperly, and that's methodology versus method.
Yes, for sure. So a methodology is not a method. It's a whole collection of methods. So if you're doing one titration, that's a method. If you're doing a titration that's followed by a PCR, that's followed by an NMR, that has a whole bunch of different steps to it, then that would be a methodology. So unless you were going to have to write more than one procedure about how you did your method, you shouldn't be writing the methodology. So think of a methodology as being a number of different steps where you would actually have to move around your lab to actually perform the whole thing.
Well, number one, I love the chemistry references. Thank you for that. Number two, there's very few times when we actually need to use methodology. And I think that's kind of what you're implying. Most of the time, we can just use methods. It's actually more concise.
And I would say that for some of the grant proposals I'm doing for university researchers, when they are actually doing a number of things in the lab in sequence to, like for nanochemistry, for example, sometimes you need a number of steps to get to your end product. Then methodology is appropriate. But yeah, I definitely change methodology to method way more times than the other way around.
Great. Well, I think that actually covers my short list for today. I'll keep it concise, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you too. It's fun.
This concludes lecture 3B, so check out the links on the blog site, and we'll see you in the next lecture.